Have you noticed a trend recently? Why do Pokemon remakes keep getting worse? I mean, just look at the last remakes, Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, and compare them to arguably the best remakes, HeartGold and SoulSilver. There's no comparing them. So where did it all go wrong? Let's go back to where it all started, and there's no better place to start than with my favorite remake, Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. So back in 2004, Game Freak decided to start a new trend by remaking their older games, and there's only one reason they would want to do that: to make more money. No, I'm not kidding. If you guys think I'm kidding, I'm not. That's the reason why they started making remakes. Because Gen 3 came out and they wanted the Gen 1 fans to come back into Gen 3. So they were like, oh, let's just make a remake. They'll want to play Gen 3 if we make the remake in Gen 3. Pretty smart if you ask me. Another reason they had these remakes made in Gen 3 was because Gen 3 and onwards, a lot of the generations lacked backwards compatibilities with older generations. So by having this remake in Gen 3, you could have a backwards compatible game to trade your Pokemon from Gen 3, and by doing that, they had also marketed the Gen 1 fans to Gen 3, starting a trend that Game Freak till this day has not broken. So in Fire Red and Leaf Green, they had all the aspects of the original Gen 1 games Red and Blue, but they added a whole bunch of additions, new graphics, new areas of the map, so many more things that were added that Gen 1 just did not have. And in addition to that, they had added the Sevi Islands, and the Sevi Islands were one of the coolest concepts Pokemon has ever added to a remake. The Sevi Islands was essentially a portal that linked the old games to the new games. You could catch Johto Pokemon in Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, the Kanto region, and you can catch Johto Pokemon. Pretty smart. Being able to catch native Johto Pokemon was a cool addition to the games. Back then, the games were really well received by critics, and they still hold up to this day. Seeing your favorite Pokemon game remade into a modern look was something that has never been done before, and for it being its first of its kind, they did an amazing job. And not only the new graphics, but the new mechanics, like adding the new types Dark and Steel and adding new moves and abilities. And with all these additions to the games, the vast majority of the community was very happy. It's everything the community could have asked for. We got the Sevi Islands, we got new game mechanics, we got new graphics, and it gave us so much more to do in the storyline. This was just the start of Pokemon remaking their older games, and it had set the bar extremely high. So people were like, oh, how can they make a remake better than Fire Red and Leaf Green? And that's where Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver come out. Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver rose that bar, not to the roof, but to the sky. I mean, maybe even space, bro. These remakes were very well done. And I think you can ask the majority of the Pokemon community, Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver are probably known as the best remakes in all of Pokemon. And till this day, people still say that Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver are the standard to how Pokemon remakes should be made. Just like Fire Red and Leaf Green, these games had updated the mechanics and graphics, but the most notable difference was the special and physical attack split that they had added. But they also did so much more in these remakes. They allowed us to catch all Pokemon Gens 1 through 4, giving us an insane variety of Pokemon to catch and find. They gave us the Pokeathlon, which was filled with very fun minigames, lots of new routes, lots of new Pokemon, a new Safari Zone, and walking Pokemon. Like, you can literally walk your Pokemon. Oh yeah, and the Pokewalker. Can't forget about that. Oh, and the Battle Frontier, bro. I forgot about that. But HeartGold and SoulSilver had done something that the previous Fire Red and Leaf Green did not do. They had introduced the inclusion of the third version, Pokemon Crystal. So you're not just getting Pokemon Gold and Silver, you're also getting Crystal. You're getting all three of these added games into one game. It gave you the post game that Crystal has to offer, and so much more things that you can do in Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver that Fire Red and Leaf Green did not have. But these next set of remakes is what marks the turning point in Pokemon's history. Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. These remakes take place in Gen 6 of Pokemon's timeline. After Pokemon X and Y came out, they had introduced the remakes of Pokemon Alpha Sapphire and Omega Ruby. So Sapphire and Ruby were getting their remakes. Gen 3 by far was probably one of the most popular generations Pokemon has to offer, so there's no way they can mess up these remakes. But some people may argue that these remakes did not do justice to Gen 3 at all. So with this taking place in Gen 6, they had introduced the inclusion of Mega Pokemon. This marked a huge turning point in the franchise. Mega Evolutions were one of the most favorite mechanics that Pokemon had to offer, and the community loved it. While adding Mega Evolutions, it did come with a few drawbacks. It had an impact on the world building that Pokemon has made ever since the beginning. Previously, Pokemon games maintain a relatively cohesive timeline, where each game fit within the same universe, spanning different times and places. However, when Hoenn was remade, Game Freak faced a huge opportunity to leverage the popularity of Mega Evolution. Incorporating this feature into the Hoenn remake was essential. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were not just remakes, they were entirely new rewrites of the games. In ORAS, the core series of events remained, but Game Freak integrated the lore of Mega Evolutions and Primal Reversions into Hoenn's story. While Fire Red and Leaf Green added some new features, they could still be seen as faithful reskins of the older games, with the main story largely unchanged. ORAS, however, introduced major changes that prompted questions from the fans. Did Ruby and Sapphire now become non-canon? Zinnia did reference the existence of another timeline after all, but that's just where the Pokemon timeline gets a little bit tricky, which makes these next remakes in the list a little bit trickier to pull off. And that's Gen 7's Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. During Generation 7, Pokemon introduced another twist with the release of Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee. These games were specifically remakes of Pokemon Yellow, but were designed to capitalize on the success of the mobile game Pokemon Go. They featured no wild Pokemon battles, but instead utilizing the Switch Joy-Cons to catch Pokemon in a manner similar to Pokemon Go. Additionally, Mega Evolutions were reintroduced following the less enthusiastic reception of the Gen 7 battle gimmick, Z-Moves. Let's Go sold well and presented a beautifully redesigned tile-based Kanto in 3D. However, it did face criticism regarding the integration of Pokemon Go mechanics in the main series. Some fans were not pleased with these changes, and the games changed from the traditional gameplay, and it sparked a lot of debate. There were no abilities, no evolutions for some Pokemon like Golbat, nothing past the original 151 aside from the Alolan forms, and so on. This is where I think the idea of a faithful remake really started to kick in, and BDSP were just further symptoms of that. Furthermore, the remake added complexity to the timeline, making Kanto the first region to be remade for a third time, following Fire Red and Leaf Green 13 years earlier, and now introduced the most controversial Pokemon remake, Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Me personally, I didn't have a huge problem with Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Don't look at that video, I was only stating facts and a little bit of my opinion. But besides that, these games were not as bad as everybody said and made it out to be. But with that said, let's look at what everybody said about this game. By this point, it became clear to someone at the Pokemon Company that constantly changing old games through remakes could complicate the main series timeline, potentially alienating fans who care deeply about the world and its characters. So you know what they did? They created two separate games based off of Sinnoh, one being pretty much a faithful remake, and notice how I said pretty much? That's because the fanbase can't seem to agree on if it is or isn't a completely faithful remake. But secondly, they created Pokemon Legends Arceus, being a spin-off game that dives deep into the timeline of the past. So by Pokemon doing this, they essentially gave us two games, and if one were not to do well, as expected, they were to hope that the other one would do well, which it did. And I think you guys know which game did better. But surprisingly, with all the backlash from Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, they were the highest selling out of any of the remakes. But one thing that keeps getting brought up time and time again is the art style. That was the first thing everybody saw and made a lot of people judge the games before they were even released. The remakes did introduce us to Reminisce Park and a bunch of other features we didn't have in the original games. But one of the most apparent changes was the removal of the Battle Frontier. The common trend of the new remakes that I've been seeing is the removal and replacement of some older features that the older games offered. Pokemon keeps ditching our favorite parts of the older games, but replaces them with things they think would make us satisfied. The removal of certain aspects and the continuation of not listening to the fans is what ultimately keeps making each remake worse than the last one. And will Pokemon fix these underlying issues? After all, we have Pokemon Legends YA coming out very soon. But what good is my opinion? I'm only some guy on the internet. So let me know your guys' opinions down in the comments, and subscribe.